Greetings, humans of the internet, and welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as usual, from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA with some more historical insights. And I'm sure many of you are currently on vacation, are getting ready to go on vacation, or perhaps just got back from vacation. And so I figured it would be a good time to discuss one of the most popular vacation destinations in America, and that, of course, is our nation's national parks and national historical sites, particularly the history of the National Park Service. And before I die, I would like to note I would love to see Yellowstone. Problem is, with just travel prices being the way they are now, I don't know if I'll ever get to, but I am hopeful. So strap in as I dive headfirst into the history of the United States National Park Service. The idea of preserving natural and cultural places was first expressed by a man named George Catlin, who was a noted painter of Native Americans. On a trip to the Dakotas in 1831, he became concerned about westward expansion's effects on Native American civilization, wildlife, and wilderness. He wrote of his dream that there may be, quote, by some great protecting policy of the government preserved in a magnificent park, a nation's park, containing man and beast in all the wilderness and freshness of their nature's beauty. And as more and more Americans traveled westward, they discovered many beautiful places like California's Yosemite Valley and Wyoming's Yellowstone River. And early travelers and writers, like naturalist John Muir, brought the wonders of Western America's wild places to those who had never seen them. And Americans began to develop a sense of national pride in wilderness areas. And many prominent citizens followed Catlin's footsteps and advocated for the protection of such areas from commercial interest and development. Next important step in the process would happen in 1864 when the federal government moved to protect a natural landscape for the first time when it granted Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoia trees to the state of California to, and I quote, be held for public use, resort, and recreation, inalienable for time. 8 years later, in 1872, after the exploration of the Yellowstone region and the territories of Wyoming and Montana, Congress created Yellowstone National Park as a, quote, public park for pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of people. And because Wyoming and Montana were still U.S. territories at this point and not states, the first national park was cared for by the Department of the Interior. And 4 more national parks were added to the roster during the 1890s. Sequoia, General Grant, which later became Kings Canyon, Yosemite, and Mount Rainier. And without funds or staff to manage the parks, the Secretary of the Interior made arrangements with the Secretary of War to have Army engineers and cavalry units develop and protect most of these national parks. However, no single agency provided unified management of varied federal parklands. Management of national parks was supervised at different times by the Departments of War, Agriculture, and of course the Interior. Another important step in the history of the U.S. national parks came in 1906 when President Theodore Roosevelt signed the Antiquities Act. And this act gave presidents the authority to create national monuments to preserve areas of natural or historic interests on public land. The purpose of this act was to prevent vandalism against prehistoric Native American ruins and artifacts. And President Roosevelt used this act to declare the Devil's Tower in Wyoming the first national monument. However, it should be noted he was not the first president to set aside public land for cultural preservation. That happened in 1892 when President Benjamin Harrison preserved 1 square mile in the Arizona territory surrounding the Casa Grande ruins, which was an archaeological site once inhabited by the ancient Sonoran Desert people. The year 1906 was also important because that was the year Congress established the first national park with the purpose of protecting man-made structures rather than just natural features like forests and canyons. It was in June of 1906 that President Theodore Roosevelt signed the bill that established Mesa Verde National Park in southwestern Colorado to protect ancestral Puebloan archaeological sites. And it was the first archaeological site to gain federal protection. And this is very important because at the beginning of the 20th century, sites across the southwestern United States were being plundered by rogue excavations. One thing that I think is very important to note is during the late 1800s and early 1900s, national parks and monuments were independently managed and with varying degrees of success. In Yellowstone, explorer Nathaniel Langhorne was appointed the park's first superintendent. He was provided no salary, funding, or staff, and lacked the resources to protect Yellowstone against poachers and vandals. The United States Army assumed control of Yellowstone in 1886. Between 1908 and 1913, Congress had many debates whether to dam the Hetch Valley to provide a steady stream of drinking water to the growing city of San Francisco. However, the Hetch Valley was within the confines of Yosemite National Park, and preservationists, led by the aforementioned John Muir and the Sierra Club, argued that the valley should be protected against human interference, but Congress eventually allowed the building of the dam. And after the Hetchy controversy, the Sierra Club and its allies petitioned the government for stronger protection of national parks throughout the creation of a unified federal service to manage the parks. The work paid off because on August the 25th, 1916, President Woodrow Wilson created the National Park Service as an agency within the United States Department of the Interior through the National Park Service Organic Act. And this new agency was created to conserve the scenery, natural, and historic objects and wildlife within the parks and to, and I quote, provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Secretary of the Interior Franklin K. Lane appointed Stephen T. Mather as the first superintendent of parks from 1915 to 1929. And Mather was a leader in the transformation of the poorly managed and underfinanced national parks and monuments into the National Park Service. And it was under his leadership that Grand Canyon, Acadia, Bryce, Zion, Lassen, Hawaii, and Mount McKinley national parks were established. And he also successfully lobbied for enabling legislation that ensured the future creation of other parks, especially those that involved purchase from private landowners in the eastern United States, like the Great Smoky Mountains, Shenandoah, and Mammoth Cave National Parks. Another important act that would be passed in regard to the National Park Service was in 1935, and that was the Historic Sites Act of, 1935. The act gave the National Park Service additional powers, including actions involving historic preservation, and Congress directed the National Park Service to inventory historic and archaeological properties and identify those of historical significance. Excuse me, I mean historic significance. Man, that's a hard phrase to get out of your mouth. And this act was helped push by the successor to Stephen Mather, Horace Albright. And it should be noted that most national parks during this time were in the western United States. Most historic sites in the eastern United States were forts, monuments, memorials, or battlefield sites, and most of them were administered by the Department of War or the Department of Agriculture. And when Horace Albright replaced Mather in January 1929, one of his goals was to follow through on his long-held position to successfully quote-unquote round out the park system by acquiring these historic sites. And when he was invited in a presidential motorcade through the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia in April 1933, Albright discussed his shared interests in American history with President Roosevelt. And this presented Albright with the opportunity to propose the transfer of military sites from the War Department to the Department of the Interior. Roosevelt approved and told Albright to get busy with the required process. And so President Roosevelt's executive order on June 10, 1933, directed the National Parks Administration to administer all functions of administration of public buildings, reservations, national parks, national monuments, and national cemeteries to the national park system. And of course, all these duties would be combined under the 1935 Historic Sites Act. And this now gives us a chance to look at some of the early National Historic Sites and National Historical Parks. And I figured the best place to start would be the first place that was designated a National Historical Park, which was Morristown National Historic Park in New Jersey. It was created to preserve the 1779 to 1780 winter encampment of George Washington and his Continental Army. The park, as it was originally conceived, consisted of the Jockey Hollow encampment site of the Continental Army, and as time progressed, the Ford Mansion, where Washington and his wife Martha spent the hard winter of 1779 to 1780, was also added. And of course, as is often the case, many individuals came together to see that the site was preserved. However, the founding father of Morristown National Historic Park was a man named Lloyd W. Smith. He amassed a fortune in the banking field and spent much of it buying historic properties. He had long been collecting such properties before becoming involved in the Morristown initiative. By 1930, his collection was already very extensive, and he was a known personality within the community. And his hard work paid off because in 1933, Morristown National Historical Park became, well, a National Historical Park, thanks to the signature of President Herbert Hoover. And just 5 years later, on March 17, 1938, the first National Historic Site was created, and that was the Salem Maritime National Historic Site in Salem, Massachusetts. And its purpose was to promote the maritime history of New England and the United States and to preserve the historic waterfront in Salem, Massachusetts. The entire site contains 9 acres of land and 12 historic structures along the Salem waterfront as well as a downtown visitor center. The oldest structure on the site is the Derby House, which was built in 1762. The wharf was built by the Derby family starting in 1762 and extended in 1806. Other buildings include the Friendship of Salem, a replica of the Friendship, which was a 1797 East Indiaman ship, the Hawks House, the Narbonne House, the Pedrick Storehouse, the Salem Custom House, St. Joseph Hall, and the West India Goods Store. However, there were originally many more historic buildings on the premises. When the National Park Service first looked at creating the site in 1935, there were 12 buildings on the property. However, only 5 were deemed to be important enough to be kept. The rest were 19th to early 20th century buildings that were destroyed to open the space. Those buildings were the U.S. Custom House, the Hawks House, the Derby House, Forster's Warehouse, and a warehouse. The museum tells about the triangle trade during the colonial period in cotton, rum, sugar, and slaves, unfortunately, the actions of privateers during the American Revolution. Those of you who don't know, they were basically pirates with paychecks, as one of my history professors used to say. They also offer guided tours, educational programs, and exhibits that provide insight into Salem's maritime heritage and its role in the Salem witch trials. Don't really know how those two are combined, but it is what it is. I mean, hey, that's probably what Salem is best known for, right? Well, folks, it looks like the clock has gone on us again, dagnabbit, but I'm happy that I hope you enjoyed, at least I should say, our little trek through history. And what have all of we learned today? Well, I, for one, have learned that there are some sites that I think need to be preserved in their original glory. And there are definitely some historic sites that should definitely stand. And I, for one, have been to I think 1 National Historic Site in my lifetime, and I hope to see more. I've never been to a national park, but I hope to someday. And if any of you have visited any national parks or national historic sites in your lifetime, let me know in the comments. Thank you, goodbye, and God bless.